Recording in progress.
Thank you to everyone logging on. The room is just filling up. We'll get started in just a moment.
Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sari Hartman, and I serve as the Social Action Committee Chair and as a member of the Board of Directors at Congregation Beth Israel here in San Diego. Today's program was a wish list item nearly a year ago, and I am overjoyed that we are able to present it to you. Your participation today reinforces the need for continued conversations such as this and underscores the important work we and our partner congregations and organizations are doing across the country. Speaking of these partner organizations, thank you, Beth Israel San Diego, Community Scholar Program, Congregation Adath Yeshurun, Louisville, Kentucky, Flint Jewish Federation, Contra Costa JCC, Jewish Community Federation of the Mohawk Valley, Jewish Federation of Greater New Bedford, Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, Jewish Federation of Greater Santa Barbara, Jewish Federation of Ventura County, and Temple B'nai Israel, Easton, Maryland. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Bob Schlossberg of Adath Yeshurun congregation in Louisville, Kentucky.
Thank you, and good evening, or for those viewing on the West Coast, good afternoon. It is an honor to introduce our speaker, Bari Weiss. I am especially honored, not only because Bari is a world-renowned writer, author, and thinker, but we also share the same alma mater, Columbia University. Additionally, I have followed her career closely because Bari was a student at Columbia with my daughter, Elisa, and son-in-law, Stuart, who graduated a year before her. Bari Weiss is an accomplished, award-winning journalist. Whether I agree or disagree with her writing, I always admire her for being eloquent, thought-provoking, and yes, at times outspoken. She regularly challenges me to think out of the box. Bari's book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, won a 2019 National Jewish Book Award. It is a tour de force that every one of us, given the events of recent weeks, must read. The past year, Bari launched a newsletter, Common Sense with Bari Weiss, on Substack, where she is regularly writing and interviewing and sharing updates on her many interesting projects. And you can sign up at barryweiss.substack.com. This evening, we are truly in for a treat. Moderating today's program is my talented colleague, Rabbi Jason Navarez, who, for those living outside of California, is the senior rabbi of Congregation Beth Israel, a Reformed synagogue in San Diego. I highly recommend everyone go to the Beth Israel of San Diego's webpage and read his fascinating bio. It is a pleasure to introduce Rabbi Jason Navarez.
Thank you for that flattering intro, Rabbi Schlossberg. Very nice. And we are so delighted that so many from across the country are here with us. And Bari, it is an honor to join you today and to be having the opportunity to moderate and share this time with you. And I'm going to get right to it because we have so much to cover and our time is valuable here. So I believe we're in a new time of evolved anti-Semitism. It feels different, very different in this moment. The values propositions that we took for granted, the fabric of foundational American liberties that we took for granted as a Jewish community has shifted in some way. We don't have to worry. Those isms, those ways of being are not part of our norm anymore. So why the silence? Why? What's your take? And what's our message of action? And I just want to preface this by saying we're going to start with this, but we're moving into our main topic of cancel culture. We believe the times deserve to hear Bari's wisdom at this moment.
Well, first of all, it's so amazing to be connected at one moment to so many Jewish communities. And if there's some strange silver lining to this very, very hard year, it's the fact that we can all talk, so many of us together at once. So I'm really, really honored to be here. You asked the biggest question of all to start. So I would simply say that, if those of you who are watching this feel like we are living through a transformative time, if you feel like the past few weeks were a watershed moment, that maybe you're all of a sudden questioning things that you never felt you had to question before, just know that you're not alone. I think that all of us are living through that together, and it's very disorienting. I said the other day, and I'm going to repeat it again, I think maybe because some people were surprised by it. I have felt more of a sense of alarm over the past few weeks than I did in the aftermath of the attack on my synagogue, Tree of Life in Pittsburgh in 2018, the synagogue where I became a bat mitzvah. And the reason for that is that I feel what we've witnessed over the past few weeks is like the veneer is gone, the veil is lifted, the sense that anti-Semitism has moved from the lunatic fringe firmly into the mainstream of the American cultural life and into the halls of Congress, I think is a departure even from the uncomfortable place that we've been over the past few weeks. You mentioned this, Rabbi Navarez, in your opening, but I just want to reemphasize it. We are living in a time in which the political center has fallen away, in which the ideas, the foundational American ideas that we didn't even feel like we had to articulate or defend because they seemed as obvious as gravity, right? Things like the idea that everyone is created equal in the image of God, the idea that because of that, everyone's entitled to equality under the law, the idea that the amount of melanin in your skin doesn't determine your standing and doesn't determine whether or not you have inherited guilt or inherited innocence. The idea that no one should be held guilty or accountable for the sins of their parents. The idea that people should not be constrained to the lane of their birth. Like, these are foundational American ideas, even if we're imperfect, even when we don't always hew to them. And I think one of the things that's happening right now is that as those ideas come under assault, it should not surprise us that anti-Semitism moves into the mainstream. And that's what we're seeing right now. And the question, right, is what do we do about it? Now, do you want me to answer what do we do about it now?
I'm sure you'll connect it to the main topic that we have at hand, but if there's something that you feel that Jewish communities or something that's been operating for you where Jewish communities have fallen into a less than area, I'd love to hear that.
The number one thing that I think we can do is recognize that we are worthy of exactly the things that we demand of other minority groups. We are worthy to be our full selves in every single space we walk into. We are worthy of basic safety and dignity. And if it doesn't outrage you that every single Jewish space in this country now requires metal detectors or armed guards, you should be outraged. The things that keep civilization civil is being outraged at things that are barbaric. And the fact that these are things that have become normal and that we've normalized them, and that so many of us feel that we need to issue qualifiers before we demand the right for ourselves to be protected. Mm-hmm. There's like an epidemic of self-erasure in our community. Mm. An epidemic of a feeling like we are somehow, because of our success, not entitled to demand the same things that we are constantly marching for on behalf of other communities. It is time now to demand those things for ourselves and not feel guilty or bad about it. And the thing I think that has alarmed me a lot, in addition to everything over the past few weeks, is this sense on the part of so many segments of the Jewish community, like, who are we to stand up for ourselves? Or to put another way, I'm scared to stand up for us. I'm scared of what it entails to stand up for us, because standing up for ourselves right now means being called all kinds of horrible names, and that's just not worth it. And if you want to log off right now and you want one message, the one message is this: speak up now. If you think it is hard now to speak up, it is only going to get harder. And our brothers and sisters in Europe can tell us that. Our experience in so many other times and places in Jewish communities tell us that. In this country, we have rights that other Jews, our ancestors, would have died to have. It would have been their dream to have the luxuries and the privileges and the rights that we have. So let's use them. Let's use them now. Let's not hesitate. And let's feel in a deep way that our ancestors literally sacrificed themselves so that we could be able to live in this country, walk down the street wearing a Magen David without fear. If that feels like something that's at stake and that feels like something that's changing, we need to speak up now and not wait a minute longer.
This topic of anti-Semitism we could cover for hours on end. I know that, and I think you've given us so much food for thought just to start to scratch the surface. We need to speak up. We need to stand up. It has to be done now. So we're holding that, and perhaps that's our thesis as we move into our topic. And the first thing I want to do is, because I'm not sure if everybody on this webinar right now really is familiar with the term cancel culture, if they really understand it. And I would love to get your working definition of what the phrase and term means and how you personally understand it.
Okay, so what cancel culture is the latest form of ostracism or exile, being a concept that went back to the ancient Romans. Now, here's an amazing detail that I learned the other day, and it very much connects to your question. Back in ancient days, if someone had was deemed worthy, or not deemed worthy, punished with the death penalty, they had a single out, and that out was they could take the death penalty or they could ostracize themselves from the community. What can we learn from that? The ancients understood that ostracism, social death, being flung out and kept out of your community or your tribe or your society or the circle of the good, was a fate as bad as death. I bring that out to you because there's a lot of people in our culture right now who want to claim that cancel culture is not such a big deal, that it doesn't really matter. It only really happens to celebrities. But that's not really what's going on. What cancel culture is that it's a weapon. It's a weapon of tribes that are increasingly powerful in this country as a way of drawing the bounds around what is acceptable and what is not. So let me take the left for a minute, because that's where this comes up, I think, for most of us on this call, who generally live, if not in blue places, in communities where the majority of people are liberals or progressives. We could talk about the right for sure too, because it's going on there. The right, we can kind of like look to Liz Cheney and what just happened with her in the Republican caucus, as they sort of redraw the bounds of what's acceptable there or what's normal there. But when I'm generally talking about cancel culture, I am talking about an ideology that goes by various names. It goes by social justice, critical race theory. Some have called it soft totalitarianism. It is a liberal ideology that is rising on the left, that is trying to succeed liberalism itself. That ideology has overtaken many of the institutions in American life that are meant to uphold the liberal order. And the way that they do that, one of the key ways that they do that, is by canceling people who don't go along with every tenet of the new orthodoxy. The point of the cancellation, the point of the ostracism, the point of making an example of the heretic, of the person that doesn't go along with every single tenet of the new dogma, is not merely to punish that person, although that person is horribly punished. The point is to signal to everyone else in the group. If you don't want that to happen to you, if you don't want to be called a transphobe or a homophobe or a racist or a bigot or any ism or phobe, if you don't want to lose your job, if you don't want your children to be kept from getting into certain high schools or colleges, if you don't want your reputation to suffer, then you better not do what that guy did. You better profess and obey and conform and go along with what we're saying. If you're confused about the reason that so many liberals are the ones who are getting canceled, be confused no longer. The reason for that is very simple. This ideology, and I'm speaking now about the left, is actively trying to redraw the bounds of what is moral and what is normal, period. And so if they make examples of people who fall just outside of that bounds, they draw that line really brightly. The reason that this connects so concretely to the theme of anti-Semitism is that a key litmus test of this ideology on the left is Zionism. If you want to be a member of what David Hirsch, the British scholar, calls the community of the righteous, the community of the good, you cannot be a Zionist. You cannot be a Zionist, because to be a Zionist, according to this ideology, and according to Soviet propaganda, although I'm not sure they know that they're echoing it, is to be a racist. And so if you notice that a lot of people who stand up for Israel get smeared in one way or another, it has everything to do with this thing that we're currently calling cancel culture. The problem is that it's a very imperfect term because it's been stretched sort of beyond recognition. So hilariously, a few weeks ago, the owner of, I think, the winning Kentucky Derby horse race, or at least one of the main horses in the Kentucky Derby, they found that they were doping the horse. And he accused the Kentucky Derby Federation or whatever it's called of cancel culture. Well, no, that's not cancel culture. That's just about following the rules. When we're talking about cancel culture, we're talking about people getting publicly shamed for commonsensical positions, or people getting shamed for things that until 5 seconds ago fell well within the 40-yard lines of American political discourse. So that, I think, is the most, I'll get more concise, but that's a pretty short definition of what it means.
So you bring up really very thoughtful perspective on the definition, and you bring up Israel, and also we can talk about the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and seeing that in the world. But I'm gonna take it a step further, because I believe that Israel is a new form of cancel culture. Being pro-Israel is. And you recently said that cancel culture is damaging cherished American ideals like free speech and thought. So how would you apply your theory to the voice that we hear in sharing one's own free thoughts on Israel? Are people actively trying to cancel Israel in that sense from our dialogue and our way of securing in fact, as Americans, securing the American-Israel alliance?
They're trying to cancel Israel, but even more than that, they are trying to open up a gap in which anti-Semitism thrives. So by claiming that any American supporters of Israel, forget Israel, that's already beyond the pale. According to these people, it's the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East. But they go further than that, because they're basically saying Zionism is racism. Well, if Zionism is racism, Zionists are racists. And everyone knows how we should treat racists. We should publicly shame them, because racism is sort of the most disgusting thing you could possibly call someone in modernity, in progressive modernity, other than being an imperialist colonialist. So let me break it down for people this way. According to this new ideology that is hyper-racialized, in which the entire world is divided into white people and people of color, into victims and victimizers, into oppressed and oppressor, into good and bad, really, into collective innocence and collective guilt, Jews fall on the wrong side of that ledger. Forget our history, forget the fact that our genetics go back to the Middle East, Forget the fact that the majority of Jews in Israel, by this definition, are Jews of color. No, according to this view of the world, Jews are white, and white people can't be victims. Everyone should get that in their head. That is truly what this ideology believes. And if you believe that, you really come to understand why almost not a single corporation was able to choke out a statement over the past 3 weeks decrying the fact that Jews were getting beaten in the streets of places like Los Angeles and New York City. Why? Because in this ideology, Jews don't count. Let me go a little bit further with it. The way that this ideology frames Jews, let me show you kind of the two poles that we're getting squeezed in both directions from. On the far right, what is said about us? It's very familiar to us. What's being said about us is that we're the greatest trick the devil has ever played. We appear to be white people, at least American Jews, the majority of whom are Ashkenazi. We appear to be white, but in fact, we're not really white because we're loyal to Black people and brown people and Muslims and immigrants. And that was the reason that Robert Bowers selected Tree of Life as his target that day in October. Why? Because in an echo of what the people shouted marching in Charlottesville with the tiki torches saying, Jews will not replace us. Well, what did they mean? They didn't mean the Jew is literally replacing me. They meant the Jews control the banks and the Jews control the borders and the Jews support refugees. Aha, you see? They're trying to bring in all of these people to change the true nature of America, to sully pure America. Well, if that ideology feels familiar to us, it's because it's straight out of Nazi Germany. We know exactly what that's about.
Mhm.
Today on the far left, the exact opposite thing is being said about us. While on the far right, we're not white enough. On the far left, we're uber white. Why is that? Because we say we're victims. We say we're the victims of hate crimes. We say we're a minority, but hold on. We're incredibly successful, especially relative to our numbers. We benefit from our adjacency, as they would say, to white supremacy. We benefit from white privilege. We are white people, according to this view of the world. And more than that, not only do we benefit from white supremacist systems here at home, we are also doubly sinful because we're loyal to Israel, which in this view of the world is not the third Jewish Commonwealth, is not the indigenous people's return to their native land. No, it is the last standing bastion of white colonialism. So all of these things taken together help explain why Israel has become such a potent litmus test for this way of seeing the world. And the thing that is so painful, I think, I'm an elder millennial. So I experienced this a tremendous amount when I was a student at Columbia, and it's only gotten worse. It's putting young Jews who are overwhelmingly liberal and progressive to an extremely painful test. It goes like this. You want to not be canceled? You want to not be ostracized? You want to be sitting at the cool kids table? You want to sit at the table of the people that are on the right side of history? No problem. You can be a Jew. You can keep Shabbat. You can believe in God, but you need to disavow Jewish power and you need to disavow Israel. And the way that line has moved, the way the pound of flesh has gone from being a pound to 10 pounds, I have seen over my lifetime. Because when I was a student at Columbia, you could be acceptable if you disavowed the Likud party and the settlement project, which was easy enough for me and for a lot of other people. But then it shifted. Then it became, okay, so you support Israel's right to exist, but if you were back around in 1948, you wouldn't have done it then, right? Okay, you're cool. Now it's you have to disavow Israel's existence. And more than that, what's coming into it, and this is incredibly interesting to watch, if tragic and interesting, it's you have to disavow the idea of the Jews being a chosen people. You have to disavow Jewish particularism. And increasingly, and you see this now on the young Jewish left, disavowing Hebrew itself, disavowing Hebrew, claiming that Yiddish is sort of the morally pure language because it's not the language of political power. And so do not be surprised as you see the laundry list of what's required to be in that good side of things grow increasingly long. My message to all Jews, including myself, because I've had to learn this the hard way, no amount of disavowals, No amount of trying to cleanse yourself or claim that you're one of the good ones will ultimately protect you. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. And if Jewish history tells us anything, it tells us that.
Wow. Well, I'm thinking about what you referenced to, because I know you started with the polarization. You started to talk about the poles on both sides and how we've moved to these extremes and we mainly engage within our own echo chambers. I'm going to take it a step further. So when you're talking about the ideologies of these extremists superseding the ideas of even liberalism per se, let's just say, as you mentioned, how do we then again prove value on differing ideas and encouraging these healthy debates when those with the loudest microphones seem to encourage canceling those that oppose them?
Well, I think first of all, we do it by doing it,
Mhm.
right? So like, I think Judaism in this sense offers an incredibly powerful antidote to the prevailing political and cultural winds in this country right now, which are all about team red or team blue, get in line with your team, and hate on the other people. There's a tremendous amount of energy right now around hating and fearing people that aren't like us.
Mm.
And I think one of the most powerful examples in Judaism, one that I learned just this year, I always thought that, you know, the school of Hillel was privileged over the school of Shammai in Jewish arguments, because they had the better arguments, right? That the school of Hillel's arguments were just better than the school of Shammai's. But a rabbi told me, and maybe this is just a midrash, I don't know, but I loved it so much, that the reason that we privilege Hillel is because the school of Hillel taught the arguments of the school of Shammai first. In other words, Judaism itself is like the most powerful, potent example of how to live with people that you disagree with and argue with people you disagree with, literally on the pages of some of our most important books, like the Talmud, and still love one another at the end of the day, and still believe that we are Am Echad, that we are one people. I believe that in the depths of my soul. I really do. And so I think that the more I root down in my Judaism, the more it sort of gives me a North Star for how to behave in this moment. I really believe when I say liberalism, Rabbi, I don't mean liberalism in a partisan sense.
Mhm.
I mean liberalism in like the most capacious sense of what that means.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Like it's the
Yeah.
foundation that allows.
That's how I took it. That's how I took it. Yeah.
It's like the foundation that allows you and me to disagree, or you and any of these 800 people on this call to disagree, and still at the end of the day be able to sit down and, you know, have a glass of wine together.
Mhm.
That's what liberalism is. When liberalism falls away, that becomes impossible. And the whole like exceptional nature of the civilization that we live in is that unlike people in so many other places in this world, the way that we solve disputes and conflict with one another is through the thing we're doing right now, is through conversation and disagreement. When that becomes impossible, do you know what the alternative is? It's violence. It's unacceptable. And so I think what's at stake right now is like, frankly, like no less than that. That's what's at stake. And I think that one of the things that changed me about the attack in Pittsburgh was that as much as I knew intellectually that the veneer of civilization is so thin and all those things that you read from wise people, I only knew it intellectually. What I witnessed that week was a feeling of, oh no, that I felt that very viscerally and emotionally. I felt like this can go away in a second. In a second. And the way that it doesn't go away is by all of us and everyone who's allied with us. And by that, I mean allied for liberalism, for the most fundamental defense of American values. Like that's what we're ultimately defending. And I think one mistake that Jews and also non-Jews often make in thinking about Jew hatred is that the victim of it is Jews. We're just the most obvious victim of it, right? Like anyone who studied history knows that societies where anti-Semitism thrives are societies that are dead or dying. And so the appeal that we need to make to our neighbors and to other communities who maybe themselves are suffering in the ways that we are. I'm thinking right now of the Asian community in this country, Asian communities, I should say, is that that's what's at stake. What's at stake is everyone's ability to think differently, to worship differently, and to have freedom of conscience and thought. That is what's at stake right now. And that is what the attack on Jews in the end of the day is really, really about.
Just a brief comment. You mentioned the rootedness of our Judaism, that you believe it has the most impact in terms of for Jews to respond to this. That also depends on how we teach Judaism, right? If we're going to speak pediatric Judaism to a whole host of, progressive Jewish life that's coming through, and I believe that the majority of the people on here fall into that demographic, that we have to really reimagine what authentic Jewish love of literature, of history, of Am Yisrael is about. It's not so easy as just to say rooted, but what does rooted actually mean? So I don't know if you have a comment on that, but that was just.
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about this so much. I started writing a big essay about it. All I know is this: if your Judaism, and I'm speaking as much to everyone here as to myself, if a person's Judaism mirrors every single political bias and political view that they themselves hold, I'm going to suspect that that's not Judaism. And it's more like politics with a talit on. Every single view that you think if Judaism is contained to tikkun olam, or said another way, if Judaism is contained to just, Israel do or die, that sounds like something more like self-worship or idol worship than Judaism. Judaism is a 3,000-year-old civilization that has a lot of unbelievable things in it, and a lot of things that make me really uncomfortable, and a lot of things that lift me up and inspire me. It has everything. And I think that one of the things that maybe we're running up against, and I've lived all of my life basically in progressive Jewish circles, is maybe a sense that there's been a little bit too much emphasis on politics and the kinds of, phrases in Judaism that maybe accord with our modern political views, and maybe not enough complicated Judaism that also says things like, if someone's trying to kill you, run out and kill him first. That also says things beyond tzedek, tzedek tirdov, justice, justice you shall pursue. Judaism has a lot of things in it. And I think that that's one thing that's important right now for me when I think about how do I resist getting swept up in the hysteria of the current moment. For me, a lot of it has to do with like rooting down into something that anchors me beyond the politics of the day. And for me, that thing is American history and what American history tells us. And most importantly of all, it's Jewish history and my sense of my place in it, and the fact that so many people did so much so that I could have, the blessings that I enjoy.
Beautiful. So before we have many questions that are coming in. Before we get to that Q&A, I want to go back to the idea of in our political environments right now. We have a lot of voices from the left, from the right, less voices being spoken from the center. I'm thinking about Congressman Richie Torres. I'm a former New Yorker, just recently moved here. I'm from the Bronx. His district right next to AOC, right there. Young Black man who has spoken and passionately about cancel culture and about Israel, and is a pro-Israel staunch advocate. And you call him, in one of your recent writings, you call him curious. So I want to know about, I wanted you to tell us more about how he, and him being a model of what I'm talking about representing, how he might fit into cancel culture given the progressive agenda, combined with this pro-Israel understanding. You've given us a wonderful foundation for it. I'm curious how you see it for our political leaders and how
Yeah.
that impacts us.
Sure. So Richie's a good friend, and I recommend everyone check out. I'm happy to share it afterward. I did an interview with him for my newsletter called "Can You Be a Progressive and Support Israel?" and super excited because I guess Bill Maher saw it and he was on the top of the show on Real Time on Friday night. So for those who haven't seen it, you should check it out. Richie, the reason I described him as curious is that I think he's an increasingly rare breed. And that rare breed is someone who's a political progressive. He's Black, he's gay, he's Democrat, and he is pro-Israel. Now, if you don't think that that's curious at this moment, I'd like to smoke what you're smoking, because right now that's really exceptional, especially in a Democratic Party where the prevailing political winds are at the backs of people like Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and AOC. And if you don't think that's true, look at what Chuck Schumer said 2 or 3 years ago when Ilhan Omar tweeted all about the Benjamins, and look at what he said. I think it was one line on Facebook over the past few weeks. That should tell you everything about where real power in the party is leading. So the reason that I feel that it's so important to elevate voices like Richie Torres or people like Kristen Sinema or this new guy Peter Majere, there's a few, is because I think that they are trying to hold a center, trying to hold a place for looking at things issue by issue and being willing to buck what's becoming the orthodoxy inside their own parties. So people like Richie Torres and Kristen Sinema to me are incredibly important right now. Connor Lamb, my state from Pennsylvania. These are people that we really, really need to support and give them the megaphone, which is what I've really tried to do with Richie over the past few weeks. When you talk about cancel culture, what's happening in each of the parties, it's not news to anyone watching, is that energy right now, like political energy, which is a kind of woo-woo way to say it, but it's real. It's not in the center. It's not with the moderates. It's with the extremes. And America is not exceptional in that way at all. That's the case throughout Europe, beyond Europe. That's the case throughout the world. There's a feeling right now, there's the title of this book by this Catholic philosopher, Rusty Reno, I think his name is, the editor of First Things. And his book is called The Return of the Strong Gods. And I love that title because I think that it sums up a lot of what we're living through right now. This kind of post-war consensus politics, the kind of politics in which like James Carville and Mary Matlin could get married and everyone thought that was swell, which I certainly did. The kind of politics that felt like, yeah, you vote one way or the other and that's okay. Like that feels like it's ending. That feels like that was this amazing holiday from history or bubble from history that is now well and definitively over. And that's painful, but that's what's going on. And I think one thing all of us need to be doing right now is, regardless of where you are, I think we would all agree that when the political center is healthy and holding, we know that that is a better situation for Jews and for the country. And so whatever side of the aisle you fall on, I hope you will see people like Richie Torres as being incredibly important voices in this moment.
Thank you. Just one more thought or question before we head to the Q&A from our large community here this evening or this afternoon. So increasingly we're operating on tweets and memes and infographics rather than actual facts. And for me, Twitter has felt incomparable with critical thought. Yet these sound bites have become our modus operandi for making profound, grandiose statements. So as a journalist, how do you understand this new form of communication given the ongoing rise of cancel culture?
It's like asking me in the 14th century, how do I understand the printing press? Like, the reason I say that is that I'm not sure we are fully appreciating the extent to which we are living through an information revolution, a technological revolution. When historians look back on what's going on, that's going to be the headline. It's not going to be Trump. It's not going to be any of the other stuff. It's going to be, holy shit, holy crap. These people, their brains were getting rewired because of this technology that we're speaking to each other through right now. That's what's happening. And I think the idea that any one of us thinks that we can somehow resist it is like suggesting that we can stand alone on a beach and have a tsunami pummel us and stay erect. We're being transformed by this. And even if you're not on social media, and good for you, wonderful, you're still being affected by it because the entire world is being shaped by it, as you just referred to.
Yeah.
So that's what's happening. And I'm as victim to it as anyone else. The challenge, right, is how to make sure that we ourselves maintain our ability for critical thought, and maintain our ability to hear other people and really understand that the business model of these platforms is to keep me outraged, like a mouse hitting a pellet with sugar. That's quite literally what it is. It's
Yeah.
it's not to inform me, it's to keep me outraged. So that's the big thing, right? Like that's the 100-pound gorilla in the room. And I think it's very, very, very important for the Jewish community and especially Jewish organizations to understand that even if you hate it, this isn't going away. It's transforming us. Okay, so how do we play ball in it? And how do we harness it? And that's something that I'm spending a tremendous amount of time right now thinking about, because if you just look back on the past few weeks, right, take the example of Meghan McCain, who is an absolute hero on behalf of the Jewish people over the past few weeks. I mean, I want to give her a moral courage award, and I'm trying to raise the money to do it because her and Bill Maher were like holding up a torch in popular culture over the past few weeks, whatever you think of their politics. Anyway, so when I was looking at Meghan McCain's, I went to college with her, so I was also emailing with her about it. When I looked at her Twitter, her Instagram, I found that she was having to, like when she was trying to amplify pro-Israel voices, it was the same 4 people. But if I looked at like Bella Hadid or Gigi Hadid or all these other people, there were hundreds of thousands of people that they could retweet and amplify. We might not be able to win the social media war, but it's vitally important that we have an army on the field. It's vitally important that we don't just simply say we can't win it and walk away. I think it's an important new mechanism. It's intimidating, it's scary, but I think it's really important that we understand it, because when people who don't know as much are looking to signal or looking for tools really to help them make the argument, they shouldn't have to go out and read 10 books to figure out like something they can say publicly in support of Israel or to combat anti-Semitism. Those things should be readily available to them. And I'm sort of shocked that at how few things were out there. I wrote this 3,000 word essay, which was good, but it was 3,000 words. And I saw that that was the main thing people were using to like respond to memes. That's not going to win the day online. And so I think it's an important and complicated thing for our community to think about.
I think people are looking for Torah, and your Torah sometimes is a foundational text for people in the social media sphere, whether you like it or not, whether they agree with you on other areas, but you're a very important voice, especially in this area. And that is, and so I honor that, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm moving a little bit into the Q&A here, and I'm trying to make a mavdil, sacred distinction and separation here. It's a little hard because you brought so much to the table today. But one of the questions is that you've defined cancel culture as canceling what was previously normative in standard political discourse. What is the litmus test for challenging racist or anti-Semitic statements that public figures make? And is there any position that someone can take where they can be canceled? For example, President Trump at the Capitol. Where is that litmus test? How do we understand that?
Sure. So, I mean, I believe that there should be taboos. And I believe that our previous president violated a lot of those taboos. I mean, my old colleague and good friend at both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times just had the line on this, which is that Trump dismantled the moral guardrails that keep bigotry down. And I really believe that he did do that, regardless of the fact that I liked a lot of his foreign policy. So there are taboos, and those should remain taboos, but it should not be a taboo for me to say that there are differences between men and women. That's something that you really cannot say, let's say in the context of the New York Times. The debate, let's say, about the place of trans athletes in high school sports. It's a very morally complicated debate, but it's a debate. And there are trade-offs on both sides of that debate, regardless of where you fall. That seems to me to be something that we should be able to have a sane conversation about online and a sane conversation about in our newspapers. I'm taking this as one of so many examples.
Sure.
It's an untouchable subject right now. It's a third rail. Let's take an example of the head of diversity initiatives at Google, who wrote in a blog post that Jews have an insatiable appetite for war and killing. Think about if that was said about any other minority group in the context of a company like Google or Apple. That is libel. I don't know what else to call it. And yet the punishment that was meted out to that person was simply that he was reassigned within the company. So the thing to ask yourself, right, is not, it's to look at what the group of people who believe that every microaggression should be cause for total destruction and where they fall on the question of Jew hatred. And you will find consistently that somehow that is the one thing that is tolerated again and again and again. And so that's where, for me, it starts to, it raises my hackles. That's where I start to become suspicious and say, wait, this is an ideology that claims to be about inclusion and diversity and tolerance. Those are all things that I support. And yet when it comes to out and out anti-Semitic statements, they have no problem with them. The key signal example of this being what happened with Tamika Mallory, which is the example of an anti-Semite failing up. So you have her as the head of the Women's March. Then you have her in the pages of Vogue. And most recently, a few weeks ago, she's in an ad for Cadillac. How is this acceptable? How is someone who is an acolyte of Louis Farrakhan accepted in this way into the cultural mainstream by organizations who have fired people for bad tweets?
Right.
Just ask yourself that.
So another thoughtful question here. Could you speak to the issue of progressive Jews who are generally pro-Israel but are critical of certain aspects of its domestic policy and find themselves canceled by their co-religionists?
Okay, so I'm not sure the questioner there, canceled by their co-religionists from what direction?
So I'm going, this is just what I'm reading off the Q&A, but I'm going to reframe it and say that I believe it's when individuals, progressive Jews are critical of the issues that are going on in Israel around any specific domestic policy, but they're canceled by their pro-Israel stance. What are your thoughts about it? How do you reconcile?
So again, this word canceled is really hard because I'm strongly criticized, maybe would be the word, but maybe canceled in some cases. Look, I am a very strong critic of the government of the state of Israel. I mean, I've written really harsh things about it in places like the New York Times. I try and be selective about when I do it. I try and criticize from a place of love, but I do it. And so I know also what that feels like to get an email from someone that loves me on one day, and now they're saying I'm a traitor to the Jewish people because how dare I criticize the rabbinate, or how dare I describe, being at the Kotel with, Rosh Chodesh group, feminist group on the women's side of the Kotel and getting called a whore and getting spit on and getting called Vashti, which was an interesting insult. I've never been called Vashti before. So I feel that, and it's painful, and I understand that. I guess I would say that for me, and I think for the majority of people in the Jewish community, as long as the criticism is coming from a place of love, as long as the criticism is, you know what, Israel's policy in East Jerusalem is not good for Israel. Israel's policy with regard to those 6 homes in Sheikh Jarrah was really misguided and wrong. That was a mistake. Rather than Israel doesn't have a right to exist and it's the worst commits the worst human rights atrocities of anywhere in the world. If you're saying that, listen, and if you're and the person who's listening to you is a more conservative, more right-wing, more pro-Israel Jew, and they're thinking, what are you doing? Look out there in the world. We've got enough coming at us. Like, quiet down a little. Like, so there's a conversation that I think it's actually a really thoughtful and interesting question, because it has to do with the internal conversation that we have as a community and the external one that we present publicly. And I think there's a sense right now on both sides, let's say, although there are a million sides of the Jewish community, that each side's argument is kind of getting weaponized against the broader community, right? So it's like, if you're on the political left, you're saying, look at these pro-Trump Jews. They're like, they're in league with our enemies. And the pro-Israel Jews are saying, look at these left-wing anti-Zionist Jews. They're in league with our enemies. And I would like us as a Jewish community to get to a place where we're thinking, how do we root down in genuine Jewish values that we have in common? How do we say, you know what, guys, like, Jews are getting beaten in the street right now for being Jews. Let's maybe set aside our differences for a second on what we think of like the Israeli rabbinate. Because I kind of feel like we've got an emergency situation right now in this country.
Mhm. I concur, for sure.
And I'm saying that as someone that hates the Israeli rabbinate, to be clear.
Yeah, I can tell you my issues with them as well. We won't go there right now. I have two questions that are specific to you. One was a question about the New York Times. What caused you to leave the New York Times?
Oh man, so there's like a long, tedious version of the story, which involves like the fact, going back to before when I said this Israel becomes a litmus test. So that was a litmus test that was put to me from the first day I walked in.
Mhm.
I was already never going to be invited to sit at the cool kids table because I was a Zionist. That was very, very clear from day one, that was the thing that made me suspect. But you know what? It was the New York Times. And I was totally fine not being invited to sit at the cool kids table for the ability to use and experience the most powerful platform in the world, whether you love it or whether you hate it. That's the reality of what it is still. Hopefully it won't be forever, but that's what it is still. So ultimately, the reason I left, though, was that the things that I had come to the paper to do, I could no longer do. And I mean that quite literally. My job was to commission op-eds and write op-eds that would not otherwise appear naturally in the pages of the New York Times. And by the time that I left, following the whole brouhaha surrounding Tom Cotton's op-ed, which I'm sure you all will remember, the Overton window, what political scientists call the Overton window, the spectrum of opinion that was considered acceptable or kosher had narrowed to a sliver. So half of the things I wanted to write about I was no longer able to write about. In addition to that, the fact that my ideas fell outside of what had become the new norm at the New York Times meant that I was an acceptable target for bullying. So in my case, that meant Slack channels. So it's internal company-wide chat with thousands of people where my name was affixed with guillotine and axe emojis, where people were openly saying, when is Bari Weiss going to be fired? Where my colleagues, some of them wouldn't speak to me. So that was in addition to everything else. So it was kind of like, if I'm going to be openly bullied and I'm not going to be able to do my job, it's sort of not worth it. Because I didn't come to the New York Times to say that I worked for the New York Times, as wonderful as it is to tell certain people that you work there. It's terrible in other cases. But in a lot of cases, it's great. And I felt, it really has to do with, in a way, what we've been talking about the whole time, which is like, what is your North Star? What are the things that you are willing to sacrifice for? What are the things you are willing to give up for the things you really believe in? And for me, like, it's very clear to me what I really care about. And what I really care about is telling the truth. What I really care about is being honest, even when it's inconvenient to me. What I really care about is living by my Jewish values and not betraying who I am in order to be acceptable in a context like the paper.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately why I had to leave. Some say I was canceled. I think I sort of pre-canceled myself, to be honest with you, because really what it was I knew that if I stayed and I even had the smallest of errors, or if I wrote a piece that, sent Twitter into an outrage, that they would sort of find a way to push me out. And I basically thought to myself, let me self-deport and let me pick up the flag that I feel the New York Times has put down by doing journalism again in the way that I feel it needs to be done.
So, which leads to the next question, which it has been really honoring of your voice. Even preceding our time today, I received even from colleagues, you shouldn't have Bari Weiss on.
Why?
Why? Because things that you've written maybe in college or positions that you've taken were unpopular to perhaps them and maybe their cohorts and their circles of play that they're in. And I said to them, and my language was very, very consistent, you're asking me to cancel a voice who's speaking on the issues of cancel culture. I said, and she's not only a brilliant voice, but a brilliant Jewish voice who speaks to the ideals which I believe and uphold. And so we may not agree on everything. I may not agree with everything you write, but I respect your pen. I respect the power of what you've shared. And also, I think so many of us, Reese, that's why you have so many on here today, to hear what you have to share, because it's enlightening and it gives us so many diverse perspectives. And so that is why it was something that I felt needed to be said. And I think we're all trying to walk the talk. We're all trying to, there are many that are quiet, and I know you've mentioned that. But I think we're all trying to find our language and our truth in stepping up, even in the moments where we feel we're going to be ostracized. So, and for me, some of that is attributed directly to you. So without you even knowing. So I appreciate that. I'm going to go with one more question, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I want to just share one more question here. There are many. And I'm sorry for those I couldn't get to your questions. We have quite several dozen questions that came in. I'm trying to get one outside of the realm of Israel. I'm just trying to focus. Oh, so I'll go with the last question, which was, how have your positions, if at any, evolved over time? What has, where, when you, in your Columbia days to now, where have you seen your own voice evolve? What has changed for you?
God, that's a good question. God, any number, I think that I've been mugged by reality a little bit, if I can say that. I think that I didn't understand, I think I was a little bit naive about human nature and speaking to the issue of cancel culture, naive about how powerful the forces of conformity are in human beings, in human nature. How powerful the desire to belong and the desire not to be ostracized is in all of us, and how exceptional it is when people are willing to risk that, and that is incredible. I think that's one thing where I'm astonished at how naive I was. God, there's a number of things. I mean, the questions about liberalism itself and whether there's something like weak in liberalism that allows for it to be overtaken by illiberal ideologies. I know these sound high-minded, but those are the kind of deep philosophical things I've been thinking about. I could tell you about any kind of, that I've become much more passionate about criminal justice reform, that I didn't really understand the sort of systematic racism of drug war policies in a way that I do now. There's lots of things like that. But to me, the more interesting things where I'm really wrestling have to do with like politics writ large and human nature writ large. And the wisdom, I think, in the Jewish view that we all really have this Yetzer Hara and our Yetzer Hatov, and that we have inclinations for good and evil. And what are the forces that incentivize us to go in one or another direction? That's really where my head is now in a way that it never was before. Can I say one thing though that's positive do we have to wrap up? Because
no, please share.
Yeah, I know we've been talking about some heavy topics, and I just want to, first of all, thank you for having me. And it's pretty much every group I speak to now. One of the rabbis says, a lot of people told me not to have you, so thank you. I'm getting used to it, as sad as it makes me, but I'm getting used to it, and I really appreciate you not caving. And I think it's a really, really important message to send. It's not about me. It's about the ability for people to disagree in public and not rip each other apart, and to hear from people that maybe are outside of our usual ken, and to model the inclusivity culture, I guess we could call it.
Hmm.
The other thing I would just say, and this is where my head is a lot these days too, which is in Jewish history. And I have to say that I know that a lot of people look at Jewish history, and I think that there's that famous, maybe Salo Baron, or maybe it was Yosef Yerushalmi's phrase, like the lachrymose theory of Jewish history, that it's just like the trail of tears and pushing back against that. And I really feel that way. Like, I really feel that when I look back at let's say, like what Natan Sharansky sacrificed, or what Hannah Senesh sacrificed, and everyone can think of their own name of their own Jewish hero right now, like the things that are being asked of us right now pale in comparison to that. And I think it's really important to keep that perspective in mind. The other thing that I think Jewish history teaches so powerfully, like so powerfully, is that small groups of people can truly bend reality. We can bend the arc of Jewish history. And the most powerful and potent example of that, and everyone should go and read Mati Friedman's latest piece on this in Tablet, is Theodor Herzl, the man who changed Jewish modernity and Jewish security and the Jewish return to political power, which was unfathomable to everyone around him, was putting up a Christmas tree while he was writing the Jewish state. His thing that he was most anxious about at the Zionist Congress in Basel, he writes about this in his journal, was that he was asked to give an aliyah and he didn't know the words. That is the person, like, just think about that.
Mhm.
He wasn't a rabbi, he wasn't a scholar, he didn't have president or CEO by his name. And so I think it's important for like every single person on this call who maybe feels overwhelmed by this historical moment, and I get it, because I do too a lot of the time, is to recognize that like we have tremendous power. We have tremendous power, and we don't need to have a PhD, and we don't need to have, 5 years in rabbinical school to exercise it. And so if I can leave everyone with that message, I think that, the more we look to the past is like our compass. It's like our moral manual for the present. And the more that I've done that in my own life, the more I've been able to access the little courage that I've been able to express in the world.
I can't think of a better chatima, a better seal to this moment than for what you just shared. I know that post our conversation today, we're also going to be sharing a reading list that you suggest. So there may be some additions that Bari is adding, and we will be sending that to everyone. I'm going to turn in a moment to a colleague of mine to wrap up. I just want to say how brilliant this moment has been and how wonderful and real and authentic it has been. So thank you from all of us to sharing your truth and your wisdom and your love of Israel and your love of humanity. I very much appreciate it. And your journalistic prudence is widely held here. So thank you. And I call upon my colleague, Stephen Lowe from Flint Jewish Federation to close us out today.
I want to thank you, Bari, and Rabbi Navarez. I found this presentation captivating, by turns informative, thought-provoking, quite frankly, alarming at times. And yet at times, I would hope that it would inspire us to actually take some action. And I think you pointed the way that we should do that. Thanks to also Rabbi Schlossberg, and Eileen Titro and Aliyah and all of our partners who came together and worked hard to make this a possibility. It was fantastic. Thank you. And thank you all for attending. So, good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you,
Take
Barry.
care.